thanks to the special counsel's thorough investigation, we now know that the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or the Trump campaign, or the knowing assistance of any other American, for that matter.
What I liked about what Barr did here, and there's some things I didn't like, I just call it as I see it, but what I did like was that he left it to the DOJ, not himself, to make the decisions. He gave the guidelines as to what should be redacted. Those guidelines aren't unusual, but he did not himself have any involvement per se in the redaction. He let other people, non-political people, do that.
Joining me now is Law and Crime Network host and former prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney, Bob Bianchi. Bob, thank you so much for being here. Today is a pretty big day. The redacted version of the special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia report dropped. This is all of the buzz today, 400 pages. I'm not sure if you got through all 400 pages, but I know that you definitely skimmed through it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to it. And I concentrated mainly on the obstruction pieces, since that seems to be the more wobbly part of all this, given the fact that they indicated there was no collusion, i.e. in the legal world, conspiracy with regard to the Trump campaign and Russians.
So what are the biggest takeaways for you? Obviously, we know over the past 2 years, President Trump and anyone in his orbit have pretty much been dragged through the mud, saying that they were Russian operatives, that they were taking direction from the Kremlin. But clearly that wasn't true. And this report, again, is evidence of that.
Yeah, Stephanie, I think that that people are politicizing this based upon whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, and where you sit is where you stand in terms of the ideas here. But as a prosecutor, let's flip it for your audience a little bit and say this was Hillary Clinton that won this investigation. And they get information from a foreign intelligence source that indicates that somebody, either Clinton and or her campaign, are working with foreign nationals in order to influence the campaign. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican doesn't make a difference. The FBI is an investigative agency. This is a profoundly problematic thing for our democracy. So it's no shock they would open up a file. If they didn't, they would be considered malfeasant for not having done so. And I think what the public gets concerned about in the political world is that if their guy or their girl gets investigated, that they believe automatically means that that person is going to be found guilty or responsible. I opened up many political corruption investigations, and at the end of the day, I had to do it. If I didn't, people would think, well, you're just being favorable to one side or the other. And in 95% of those cases, there was not sufficient evidence to move forward in order to bring charges or an indictment. And that's what I think is really fascinating to me about the Mueller report. I think it was very thoroughly done. I thought it was very professional. But people also mix up the idea of what prosecutors do when they make decisions to either prosecute or the declination, that is, the refusal to prosecute. They have to prove a case in a very specific way to 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to do that with O.J., and O.J. was found not guilty. But that doesn't mean that O.J. didn't do it. A civil jury with a lesser burden of proof, a preponderance of the evidence, found on the same exact evidence that, in fact, he was responsible. So there's a huge difference between proving a case beyond a reasonable doubt and the truth.
How do you compare our Attorney General William Barr's summary of the report versus the entire report? Obviously, this was a redacted version. There were things cut out. I actually expected more to be blocked and cut out from this report, but they were pretty generous.
Yeah, I was heartened to see that, Stephanie. I was under the belief that we were just going to be looking at a lot of black pages. And what I liked about what Barr did here, and there's some things I didn't like, I just call it as I see it, but what I did like was that he left it to the DOJ, not himself, to make the decisions. He gave the guidelines as to what should be redacted. Those guidelines aren't unusual, but he did not himself have any involvement per se in the redaction. He let other people, non-political people, do that. So we got a lot more data and information than I expected, and I think that's healthy for our country.
We heard a lot from Rudy Giuliani, and he, is still, again, talking about how this whole investigation came to be. He's also talking about how unfairly the president was treated, and he was talking about the Donald Trump Jr. Trump Tower meeting with some Russians and was basically saying that this was a setup.
That meeting was a setup. I mean, the day before the meeting, the Russian woman, Natalia, met with the person who ran Fusion GPS. Boy, that's a coincidence, right? And this guy testified under oath. They never talked about the meeting we're going to have the next day. And then she met with him the day of the meeting. And then she met with him the day after the meeting. They set up the meeting on the pretext that it's going to be about dirt on Hillary. Nobody has any dirt on Hillary. They don't talk about dirt on Hillary. They talk about the Magnitsky Act and Russian adoptions. And then they walk out and they never really seriously call back and follow up on it. And several of them are counterintelligence operatives. That was a pure setup.
Do you think there is any truth in anything to Giuliani is saying?
No. The June 9, 2016 meeting at Trump Tower with Junior, Jared Kushner, Manafort, Vetselnskaya, a Russian operative for the government, which is very clear to me, and other Russians, is supported by the emails that were secured, where it indicated it was very clear that that meeting was for the purpose of securing dirt on Hillary Clinton. Now, that is technically a crime to attempt to do that. What people get confused about that is that they say, well, they never got anything. Well, they never got anything. Defense doesn't work for anyone else in the world, especially the little guy. It's the attempt to do it. Now, as a prosecutor, I can decline to prosecute if I feel maybe they were naive, maybe they didn't get what was going on, they didn't understand the gravity of what happened, and in fact, because they did not get anything and it did not have an impact on the election, I would be very weary to bring charges against people under those circumstances. I've done this many times where I would write to the political establishment to say, hey, guys, FYI, while I'm declining to prosecute, this kind of conduct cannot occur in the future. You're on notice that the attempt to get information from foreign nationals to affect an election, whether it affects it or not, is technically a crime. Don't do it again. But you know what? Listen, it was like the Hillary Clinton investigation when I was opining about that. The mere fact that you may have a technical violation of a law of a high-level authority figure doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to prosecute the case, because you've really got to have your I's dotted, your T's crossed, and you better be absolutely certain you can prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt before you go after such high-level officials. And I think what Mueller was saying in his report, to get back to that on the obstruction piece, was here are 10 areas that we find, either alone and or in combination with one another, that while we're not doing a traditional prosecutorial analysis, Stephanie, I'm telling you what the verbiage is here. Look at page 1 and 2 of the report. They can't do a traditional prosecutorial analysis here because there's a DOJ memo that doesn't allow the prosecution of a sitting president. And I think Mueller was very circumspect and correct in saying that it would be unfair to hold Donald Trump accountable and say he committed a crime if in fact that's what he wanted to do. And I'm not saying that's what he wanted to do, but imagine how unfair this would be to the president to say, we believe you committed a crime, we can't prosecute you because of the DOJ memo, and now Donald Trump is left with no recourse to be able to defend himself. And I say that whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, that would be an unfair thing, and I think it would be detrimental to the national security interests of this country.
Well, but it wasn't illegal for a campaign to collect dirt. I mean, campaigns do that all the time. And also, I mean, if we're talking about that, you can look at the DNC and the Clinton campaign paying a British spy to come up with all of these really salacious claims for the Steele dossier that then went to BuzzFeed, that then was used to bring to the FISA court. I mean, that doesn't seem right either. Obviously, that's not in this report. But there was a couple things that stood out to me that we're finding out that people are talking about, would be that the report revealed that Trump was worried about the Mueller probe and how it would paralyze him domestically and abroad. I mean, to have this cloud over your presidency for your first 2 years it's not a great position to be in if you're the president of the United States.
Yeah, well, and that kind of goes to the idea that before you can charge somebody with obstruction, even with those 10 points that Mueller punted over to Congress, you have to show a corrupt intent. It has to be a corrupt intent. Now, if you don't like the idea that, let's assume for the sake of argument, here's how I'm putting it, that we know there's no underlying crime here. That's a big factor in favor of the president. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be charged with obstruction, but it's a biggie in terms of the analysis. And let's assume that he says this is a witch hunt and I'm being prevailed upon and this is a lie and I can't move forward with my administration because of this constant cloud over me. Well, he has Article 2 powers to be able to exercise his authority over these individuals. And if he fired Comey, say, for example, or wanted to get rid of Mueller because he felt that that was the appropriate thing to do to move forward as opposed to covering up for a crime, then you don't have a corrupt purpose and it would be completely lawful. And I think that's kind of the flavor of what the report says there, is that you have to get into the mind of an individual. And as prosecutors, when you do that, if there are alternative explanations as to why a person is using their authority and doing the things that they're doing, and it could be that it's for a non-nefarious purpose, you can't, in my mind, prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt without a smoking gun.
What are your thoughts on this? They're saying that Trump attempted to influence Mueller's investigation, but ultimately failed because his aides refused to comply with his orders.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting piece, too. The fact that McGahn and Corey Lewandowski and other individuals refused to follow what the president was asking them to do is really close to the line. I mean, it's not so much what they did, it's what his intent was when he was asking them to do that. But again, I go back to the idea that if he was asking them to do that because he believed he was being unfairly treated, that his administration was being scuttled merely for the purposes of politics, as opposed to looking into a legitimate or lawful investigation, then you're going to, as a prosecutor, in my mind, not be able to convince 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a corrupt intent in those things. So what Mueller did was he took all those 10 pieces and said, either individually or alone, it may or may not be. We can't exonerate him, and if we could exonerate him, we would, which tells you they felt, or at least some on that team felt, all of those things combined together could have amounted to a circumstantial case of a corrupt intent.
I believe that Giuliani was saying that, this case necessarily, how would they go about exonerating him in this case? Was that the duty of this case, or wasn't it really just to show that there was no Russia collusion?
Yeah, no, there were two pieces to the investigation, but you bring up a really good question. Let's go back to James Comey when he got up with that ill-fated news conference where he exonerated, if you will, Hillary Clinton, which was crazy because that wasn't his job to do that. But he then went on to personally attack her for being reckless, which is clearly outside the parameters of me as the head of an agency. When you give a press conference, you would never make those gratuitous personal comments about your feelings about them being anything other than guilty of a crime. So here we have an alternative scenario where they're not going to accuse him of a crime, and it would be inappropriate for them to stand up there and say, look, we have all this evidence here. We believe it's a crime, but we're not going to charge him because of the DOJ memo. I think Mueller pulled back from that and said, here's what we got. You guys in Congress decide what it is you want to do. I think that was the appropriate way to resolve that issue.
What about the president not being subpoenaed for an interview with Mueller? We know that his team he was given some good recommendations to not, because this could have set himself up for a disaster, because if he says one wrong thing, it could be taken out of context and it could be spinned into some sort of lie.
Well, since we, the caveman, had the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and I'm kidding and being facetious when I say that, we as lawyers say all the time, and as prosecutors we get, it's a famous Supreme Court decision that said the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent not only protects the guilty, but protects the innocent as well. It would have been, in my opinion, defense lawyer malpractice to bring any client in under these circumstances, especially when you don't know what it is that they have, because you, like you indicate, may inadvertently say something where somebody could say, now you're lying and obstructing justice, or you may walk yourself into an element of the offense that they did not have and they couldn't prove, but your statement locks you in. I can't count how many times as a prosecutor, if it weren't for the fact that the defendant or the target at the time spoke to us, we never would have had a case against them.
Well, and especially considering what happened to some of the people in President Trump's orbit, I could see why they would have given him that advice. Now, lastly, Giuliani thinks it would be good if Mueller testified before Congress, because now there are some angry Democrats. They're not happy with the report. They weren't happy with the summary. Really, they're just not happy that some of them had been pushing a conspiracy theory for the past two years that President Trump and his campaign colluded with the Russians. So now they're going after Mueller. Is that what do you think? What would you advise Mueller to do?
Well, I think Mueller should testify. I think it's important that the American people hear the process upon which he went about what he did when he did. I would suspect, though, if that report were more scathing or if it came out and said that crimes were committed, Mr. Giuliani would say that he should not testify. So where you're at right now, Stephanie, is a political thing. It's no longer a legal thing. It's one side wanting to champion something. If it's good for them and if it's not good for them, the shoe's on the other foot. If Mueller came out with a report that was more scathing and more problematic, he'd be a bum. But now that he comes out with something that's, halfway decent, if you will, if you want to look at it that way, now he's a hero. And it's unfortunate that there's such intellectual dishonesty where we as lawyers, as prosecutors, even as defense lawyers, try to get to what the quote-unquote truth is. But make no mistake about it, the Democrats are going to make a lot of the fact that he did not indicate that he was exonerated from the obstruction. And when you get into the political process, you don't have to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. You just need to prove the case in a court of public opinion. So I assume that this is going to go on and on and on with respect to these obstruction charges.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your insight, Bob. We really appreciate it.
You got it, Stephanie. Thank you.